Is revolution about to come to China? Depending on who you ask, China is either an unstoppable juggernaut heading towards world domination or a fragile edifice on the verge of collapse. Here's well-known geopolitical analyst Peter Zion on China.
And by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers. And by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million. So the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure.
Zion argues confidently that demographic issues, i.e. a rapidly aging population, are going to lead to a meltdown in China in the next few years. But are Zion and the other China naysayers right? In this two-part series, we're going to take an astrological perspective on this question. And I'm going to show how astrology suggests that China is indeed heading into some challenging times. In this, the first of this two-part series, we're going to see how transits of Neptune and Uranus through the sign of Aquarius led to the making of the Chinese state that we know today. And in the next episode, we're going to think of the implications for China of Pluto, planet of transformation and death rebirth processes moving through Aquarius too. And the reason for all this is that the ascendant and the moon in the China chart are in the very earliest degrees of Aquarius. China isn't the only state that will be transformed by Pluto in Aquarius, but it's pretty much the first in line. So strap in and let's set off on another journey into the past, the present, and the future of this world we're living in. If we want to use astrology to understand where China is heading, there are a few approaches we could take. One would be to figure out which planetary cycles the country's plugged into, and thus which cosmic rhythms it resonates to. I already did a bit of this work in this video, where I asked the question, are the US and China headed for war? But the approach we're going to take in this series of videos is to consider the natal chart of China and transits to that chart. That means looking at the position of the planets in relation to the natal chart over time. This is essentially similar to what an astrologer would do with a client in a consultation. And by the way, I do have some slots available for private consultations right now. Details are in the description below. But finding a chart for a country can be quite difficult because unlike with a human being, it's not always clear when a country can be said to have been born. So as with most old countries, there are several charts that astrologers use when they're looking at the astrology of China. You can find several in Nicholas Campion's essential tool for mundane astrology, the Book of World Horoscopes. But I'm going to use one set for October the 1st, 1949. This was the day the Communist Party held a massive rally in Beijing and Chairman Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. But what time did this happen? The Chinese government says that the ceremony started at 3 p.m. that day. Now, some sources claim that the proclamation happened almost immediately and use a time of about 3:01 p.m. That gives us this chart with 1 degree and 33 minutes of Aquarius rising. With that said, the famous astrologer Charles Carter gave a time of 3:15 p.m. And that gives us a slightly later ascendant with 5 degrees and 56 minutes of Aquarius rising. I'm going to use the chart for 3:01 p.m, but bear in mind that there is a degree of uncertainty about that time. No pun intended. Now we're going to see how well this chart works for China. Now the striking thing about this chart for our purposes is that both the ascendant and the moon are in very early degrees of Aquarius. The moon is at 3 degrees and 3 minutes of that sign. But first, let's think a bit more about the ascendant. What you can say about the ascendant depends a little bit on the house system that you're using. So in whole sign houses, in the case of China, the first house begins at 0 degrees of Aquarius, with a floating ascendant at 1 degree and 33 minutes of Aquarius. Now in a mundane chart, the first house represents the country in general, and it also represents the national myths and its image and its self-image. And in their book, Mundane Astrology, Michael Bajan, Nicholas Campion, and Charles Harvey give some pretty interesting examples of this. Nazi Germany had Taurus rising, and they write this: the myth which emerged was one which denigrated the intellect and glorified physical action. As a Taurus rising myself, I'm not sure how much I like that delineation, but I know what they mean. The United States Sibley chart has Sagittarius rising, and the myth of freedom is so vital to the American self-image. And in a similar way, the UK's 1801 chart has Libra rising. This is a country that has long subscribed to a myth of fair play. If you're enjoying this video, please do me a favor and click that like button And if you haven't subscribed already, why not do that now and make sure you don't miss out on future episodes. So what about China? Well, as we've seen in this chart, we have Aquarius rising. And this is a chart for the People's Republic of China. And if there's one sign that has to do with the people, it's Aquarius. It's the sign that opposes the sun sign of Leo, which is about the center, about the monarchy, about royalty. Aquarius is the sign of Saturn, which has to do with working people, particularly people who work the land. And remember, Maoism is a form of communism centered around agricultural workers. Now, for time's sake, we're not going to do a full delineation of this chart now. What we want to know is, does it work? Can we be confident that when Pluto grinds its way over the early degrees of Aquarius and conjoins the ascendant and the moon of this chart, that we'll see things happening? To answer this question, we're going to look to history. Because in the recent past, we've already seen two slow-moving planets moving over these early degrees of Aquarius, Uranus and Neptune. And we're going to see that there were some pretty momentous developments in China when that happened. First, let's consider Uranus. Uranus takes about 84 years to orbit the sun, so it spends about 7 years in each of the zodiac signs. Now, in the current cycle, it made its first ingress into Aquarius on April the 1st, 1995, and it left Aquarius for Pisces for the last time on December the 30th, 2003. Uranus is a planet associated with freedom, agitation, restlessness, sudden breakthroughs and revelations, eccentricity and revolution. Here's what the astrologer Howard Sasportas said about Uranus moving through the first house in his book, Gods of Change. The ascendant is the point in the chart associated with birth and new beginnings, and when Uranus crosses the ascendant and moves into the first house, it's almost like being born again. One's whole approach to life, sometimes even one's physical appearance or style of dress, can change. If we have not been in touch with the qualities of our rising sign, Uranus will bring these aspects of our nature to the surface now. If we've already been expressing our ascendant, Uranus asks that we explore other possible manifestations of that sign. Uranus made its conjunctions with the ascendant and moon of this chart in 1996. And it turns out that 1996 was hugely important in modern Chinese history. And the first reason for this is it's really the year that the Great Firewall of China was born. As most people know, the Chinese government maintains strict control over the internet. It prevents users from accessing certain foreign sites, and it censors a lot of information. And this is part of the way that many outsiders see China today, as a modern state at the vanguard of using information technology to govern and control its population. And this policy can really be said to have begun in 1996, when Uranus was conjoining the moon and the ascendant of the China chart. And more than anything else, Uranus is the planet we associate with technology. The Chinese got their first access to the internet in 1994, but it was 1996 when the government started to legislate to control access to it. CNN report entitled "China Places Roadblocks on the Internet," published in February 1996, opened like this. China's government has slapped a series of new regulations that control content and restrict access to the World Wide Web, making roaming the internet difficult for its people. Now, we have to say that the whole world was being transformed by the internet at this time, but I'd argue that probably more than any other country in the world, China fused the internet with state power. Remember that Sasporta said that if we've already been expressing our ascendant, Uranus asks us to express it in a new way. When Uranus went into Aquarius, the Chinese state began to shift to a new Aquarian incarnation, a 21st century state using the internet to manage, control, and conduct surveillance on its population. But 1996 was an important year for China for at least two other reasons. And these reasons have to do with the theme of rebellion. The first reason is that this was the year of the third Taiwan Strait crisis. What the hell was that, I hear you ask? Well, Taiwan is one of the world's major conflict flashpoints. And this really dates back to the Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949 with a victory for the communists who have ruled mainland China ever since. Their adversaries in that war were the Kuomintang, the nationalists, who at the end of the war fled to Taiwan and established what they called the Republic of China on Taiwan, which has remained independent of mainland rule ever since. And today, Beijing views Taiwan as a renegade province, an integral part of China that should be reabsorbed into the greater state. As far as the Chinese government is concerned, the Taiwanese are Chinese citizens. Now, there have been many crises over Taiwan, but the third Taiwan Strait crisis centered around this man, Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui, who was known in Taiwan as Mr. Democracy for his role in steering the country towards, yes, democracy. Now, the Chinese Communist Party didn't like Lee Teng-hui. They thought he was trying to move Taiwan towards full independence from China. Now, as we've seen, Uranus moved into Aquarius in April 1995. And shortly after this, Lee Teng-hui accepted an invitation to make a speech at Cornell University in the United States. This was his alma mater. Now, after some controversy, the US issued him a visa, but this really infuriated Beijing. They issued statements calling him a traitor who wanted to split China. And in July, Beijing announced missile tests and mobilized forces in a show of force intended to intimidate Taiwan. The US responded with a show of naval force of its own in the Taiwan Strait. And this crisis continued into 1996 when Taiwan organized its first direct presidential elections. Previously, presidents had been chosen by a ballot of the deputies of its National Assembly. Now, in this election, Teng-hui was a candidate and Beijing was not happy at all at the prospect of him being directly elected president by the people of Taiwan. So Beijing fired more missiles around the strait to send a message to the Taiwanese that voting for Teng-hui would mean war. In response, the US sent 2 carrier battle groups to the Taiwan Strait, indicating its support for the elections and its willingness to fight to defend Taiwan. China backed down. Those elections eventually took place on March the 23rd, 1996, with Uranus less than a degree from the moon in the China chart. Now, as far as Beijing concerns, this episode concerned an act of rebellion by a segment of the Chinese population. It's not difficult to see the Uranian signature here. And we can also note the involvement of that most Uranian of countries, the United States. But there's another reason why 1996 was a crucial year for China. And this takes us to the far west of the country, to Xinjiang province. Together with Taiwan, Xinjiang is one of the most controversial issues surrounding China today. It's home to the Turkic Uyghur people who are overwhelmingly Muslim. And in the early 90s, China began to become worried about separatist sentiment in Xinjiang. And in 1996, it launched what it called its Strike Hard campaign against crime and separatism. Wikipedia describes this time like this: China's Strike Hard campaign against crime, beginning in 1996, saw thousands of arrests as well as executions and constant human rights violations, and also marked reduction in religious freedom. These policies and a feeling of political marginalization contributed to the fermentation of groups who carried out numerous guerrilla operations, including sabotage and attacks on police barracks, and occasionally even acts of terrorism, including bomb attacks and assassinations of government officials. So while the roots of Uyghur separatism go way back, 1996 is a landmark year for it. It marked the beginning of a phase of violence. So similarly with Taiwan, with Uranus close to the moon of this China chart, we saw a segment of the country's population push for freedom. The response of the Chinese state was to step up surveillance on the Uyghur population. Once again, we see the Aquarian control state taking on new form in this period. So I think all this shows that the China chart really works, but we can get even more evidence of that, because in January 1998, Neptune also entered Aquarius and subsequently transited over the early degrees of that sign. So what happened then? Neptune is the planet astrologers associate with the imagination, illusion, delusion, and faith. I think it's the planet in astrology that's hardest to describe and delineate, because its nature is that it's ineffable, it's diffuse, it's hard to pin down. That said, it can manifest in clear, literal ways, as anyone whose bathroom has flooded with Neptune on the 4th house cusp will attest. And there are at least 2 events that I found that really do speak loudly to the kind of themes we'd expect to come up when Neptune moved into the 1st house and transited over the moon. From June to September 1998, the Yangtze River, as well as the Nen, Songhua, and Pearl rivers all burst their banks following torrential rains. China is well known in history for facing devastating flooding, but these were the worst floods to hit southern China in 40 years. And of course, Neptune is the god of the sea, and here we see a very literal manifestation of a Neptune transit, a devastating inundation. Neptune is also closely related to faith. mysticism and religiosity. Now, in the early 90s, there'd been a boom in Qigong and related practices in China. One of those practices was Falun Gong. Now, Falun Gong combines Qigong with some, let's just say, New Agey beliefs. And it was founded by a man named Li Hongzhi in 1992. With Neptune in Capricorn, the 12th house of this China chart, Falun Gong became extremely popular in China. And the 12th house is associated with meditative and mystical practices, so this makes a lot of sense. Now, the Chinese authorities were initially supportive of Falun Gong, and they tried to formalize ties with it and establish control over the movement. But it resisted, and the relationship turned sour. And in the mid-1990s, state media outlets began to criticize Falun Gong. Now, by 1999, there may have been as many as 70 million Chinese practicing Falun Gong. And it was around this time, with Neptune on the ascendant, that China's relationship with Falun Gong turned decidedly sour. In April 1999, 10,000 Falun Gong members held a silent protest at the Central Leadership Compound in Beijing. The Communist Party responded by banning it and arresting large numbers of practitioners. And to this day, Falun Gong remains banned in China. The Communist Party refers to it as an evil cult. And there are claims that the Chinese state has subjected Falun Gong practitioners to extreme repression, allegedly up to including torturing some of them to death. And the term Falun Gong is one of the most heavily censored on the Chinese internet. Again, remember, Neptune is the planet of faith and mysticism. So after erupting into the consciousness of the Chinese state with Neptune on the ascendant, this practice has essentially been disappeared in China. And the realities of what happened with it are somewhat shrouded in mystery. It's all very Neptunian. Now, to summarize, many of the issues that we really closely associate with Chinese politics and geopolitics today emerged or were given fresh impetus with Uranus and Neptune in the early degrees of Aquarius. We have Uyghur repression and separatism, we have the Taiwan question, we have Falun Gong, and we have the Great Firewall of China. First house is, among other things, a house of image. Many of these issues do undoubtedly contribute to China's image today. Of course, I want to stress that there's far more to China than these controversies, but the correlations I found, to my mind, really do show that this China chart works. And this should give us confidence that when Pluto rolls over those same degrees in the next few years, we're going to see significant events happening. But what kind of events? What can we expect when Pluto moves over the ascendant and moon of a country chart? In the next video, we're going to look at some examples of that happening to other states. We're going to use all of this information to try to deduce what's coming to China in the next few years. See you next time.